Good morning, everyone, evening or afternoon, whenever you find yourself viewing this particular video segment as a part of Join the Movement Towards Racial Justice. I'm so excited about the work this group is doing, and I just love being a part of Join the Movement. I hope you love being a part of Join the Movement as well. I am Dr. Renee K. Harrison, Associate Professor of African American and U.S. Religious History at the Howard University. We are delving into video 2 as a part of a review of this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Last month, we went through chapters 1 through 6 of the text. I hope you have had an opportunity to view chapters 1 through 6, because in many ways, that video, along with this video, is going to make some connections. And so let's begin. I'm going to screen share. In chapters 7 through 11, Dr. Kendi expands his conversation on racism by looking at various other forms of racism. Through his examination of cultural and behavioral racism and his discussion on colorism and anti-white and anti-Black, we come to greater grips with the book's central message that the opposite of racist isn't not racist. The true opposite of racist is anti-racist. And these identities, he helps us to see, or points of reference. Again, these identities or points of reference are not fixed. Kendi goes on to tell us that we can be racist in 1 minute and anti-racist in the next. And what he does here, he provides in chapters 7 through 11 a series of definitions to set the context of his study in these chapters. So he begins in chapter 7 talking about a cultural racist, and that's one who is creating a cultural standard and imposing a cultural hierarchy among racial groups. Then he moves on to, in chapter 8, a behavioral racist. He says one who is making individuals responsible for the perceived behavior of racial groups and making racial groups responsible for the behavior of individuals. And then he creates somewhat of a bridge as he moves to colorism. And in this exploration of colorism, we see that racism is not just the purview of white folks or the white community, but other ethnic groups can actually operate and demonstrate their actions of racism. He calls colorism a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequalities between light people and dark people, supported by racist ideas about light and dark people. And so from here, he moves into further conversation about anti-white racists. He set the foundation in colorism, and he moves here specifically to talk about anti-white racists. He says one who is classifying people of European descent as biologically, culturally, or behaviorally inferior, or conflating the entire race of white people with racist power. And then here we get into, finally, in chapter 11, what he calls powerless defense. And here he's drawing on several persons who have made the claim that Black people cannot be racist because they have no power. And there's James Baldwin and others who make this claim. And he moves into this space, Kendi, to say that is basically illusionary, right? The illusionary, concealing, disempowering, and racist idea that Black people can't be racist because Black people don't have power. He says that's not true. Black people can be racist with or without power. I hope you have had the opportunity to read chapters 7 through 11. And also chapters 1 through 6. But I want to, kind of put this again in historical context. In the first video discussion, I provided a historical context by examining Kendi's starting point for his racist and anti-racist discussion. His starting point is essentially himself. what I sought to do in this context, that Kendi, starting with himself, his own personal memoir about being a racist and moving towards anti-racist, I put his experience alongside Lamar Smith's story, if you remember that in video 1. And I put these stories together to suggest that both diverse stories of racism did not happen in a vacuum, but are a part of a larger framework of people's, namely Black people's, experiences of racism in American society. Now, I'm going to come off of screen sharing so that we can just have a discussion, and I can look at you and you can look at me. Well, I think I can look at you. We're on virtual, but you can look at me and hear what I'm saying much clearer. Now, I came off screen because I want to just talk for a moment about what I mean about placing Lamar's story along with Kendi's story to suggest that these diverse stories of racism do not happen in a vacuum, but they are a part of a larger framework of people's experiences. Now, I'm saying, namely, Black people's experiences of racism in American society. I say Black people's experiences because Black people did not invent racism. From the start of this country, they were both the subjects and objects and the foundation for racism in America. Kendi and Smith's individual experiences of racism, their interpersonal or individualized stories, cannot be seen absent of the systemic and structural realities of racism in America. Now, that is to say, as Paula Braidman and other authors in their article entitled Systematic and Structural Racism, Definitions, Examples, Health Damages, and Approaches to Dismantling, what these authors help us to see that beyond individual experiences and confessions of racism and racist behavior that each of us may fall prey to, beyond these individual expressions, they essentially say that racism is not always conscious, intentional, explicit, or readily visible. Often, racism is systemic and structural. And then they go on to define what that means. Systemic and structural racism, they say, are forms of racism that are pervasively and deeply embedded in systems, laws, written or unwritten policies, and entrenched in practices and beliefs that produce, condone, and perpetuate widespread unfair treatment and oppression of people of color. And that these forms of racism reflect both ongoing and historical injustices. So when we look at Kendi's story and Smith's story, we have to look at these stories within a wider net over a longer period of time that just doesn't get conflated into an individual's experience that tells us how to move from being a racist to being an anti-racist, that we have to come to grips of the depths of this racist past. And they go on to say that although systemic racism and structural racism are often used interchangeably, they have somewhat different emphasis. Braidman goes on to say that systemic racism emphasizes the involvement of whole systems and often all systems, for example, political systems, legal, economic, healthcare, school, and criminal justice systems, including the structures that uphold the systems. And they go on to say that structural racism emphasizes the role of the structures, laws, policies, institutional practices, and entrenched norms. That are these systems, or that the systems are scapegoating. Because systematic racism includes structural racism, we often use systematic racism in our discussions to refer to both. And then they go on to add another dimension to this. They say that institutional racism is sometimes used as a synonym for systemic or structural racism, as it captures the involvement of institutional systems and structures in race-based discrimination and oppression. It may also refer specifically to racism within a particular institution. And then they go from here to provide different forms of a systemic, and if I said systematic before, clearly I mean systemic racism, structural racism, and institutional racism. They provide examples by naming residential segregation, unfair lending practices, and other barriers to home ownership and acclamation of wealth, schools' dependence on local property taxes, environmental justice, biased policing and sentencing of men and boys of color, mass incarceration of people of color, and voter suppression policies. All these are aimed to disenfranchise communities of color. And what the authors help us to see is that the structures themselves, the institutions themselves, have been ingrained in racist practices for decades, for centuries. And the fact that a few Black people or a few people of color are able to move across that plane and find themselves having somewhat of access in American society does not eradicate the deeper and systemic problems of racism in America. I can think of no better person to make this point much more clear than the conversation James Baldwin had on the Dick Cavett show on June 13, 1968. If you have not had an opportunity to watch this video, I mean, in its entirety, I'm not talking about snippets or excerpts, I'm talking about the video in its entirety. I want you to take time to just look it up. YouTube, it's across the internet, and here Baldwin is trying to help David Cavett understand how racism functions in America and creates an inequality gap for people of color, especially in the context for Baldwin, Black people. Now, what happens here, as I set this up, and I wish I could play it, but copyright reasons I cannot do so. So I just want to set the context of this. What makes this so rich is that Baldwin begins to school or teach Cavett the realities of Black life in America. And in the process of this conversation, Cavett brings on Professor Paul Weiss, the Sterling professor of philosophy at Yale. He's backstage, he's listening to Baldwin. And so he brings him out. He's Cavett's former instructor, and he comes out and he's, the academic, and he's ready to school Baldwin. And so the two of them engage in an enterprise, and Cavett is sitting there, listening as the moderator, and the two of them, Baldwin and Weiss, are sitting in this conversation. And Weiss questions some of Baldwin's claims, because part of what Weiss is pushing against is this notion that racism gets exaggerated in America, right? The Black experience gets exaggerated, that Baldwin himself is an example of someone who was able to rise above the circumstances of the Black condition, right? And so he goes on to, kind of school Baldwin about how we shouldn't always focus on, though there are some really issues around color, even around religion, that this shouldn't be our focus, because there are more that we find in common with each other. We always say that, more that we find in common with each other than we do not, right? And he goes on to tell Baldwin, for example, I have more in common with a Black scholar, this is what Weiss says, than I do a white individual who does not believe or have no connection to scholarship. And you, Baldwin, have more in common with an author who is white, who thinks to some degree the way you think than you do with an illiterate, he doesn't say black man, but I mean, it's what he's insinuating, than an illiterate black man. So that it's not really about color, it's about connections and commonality. And so Baldwin leans in, and I want you to hear what he says. I mean, listen, Baldwin can say it much better than I can say it on his behalf. But I want you to hear what Baldwin has to say as Weiss says to him, all this emphasis on black men and white men, I mean, it gets exaggerated and we have to kind of find deeper connections. And Baldwin leans in and he says, I tell you this, when I left this country in 1948, I left this country for one reason only. One reason. I didn't care where I went. I might have gone to Hong Kong. I might have gone to Timbuktu. I ended up in Paris. I ended up, Baldwin says, in Paris, on the streets of Paris, with $40 in my pocket, on the theory that nothing worse could happen to me in Paris that had not already happened to me in the United States of America. He goes on to talk about what death in this country looks like for black men versus white men, and how hard it is in this reality to sit at a typewriter and concentrate if you are afraid of the world around you, that becomes the nightmare, the social terror for many black people since slavery in America. He says, the years I lived in Paris did one thing for me. They released me from that particular social terror, which was not the paranoia of my own mind, but a real social danger, visible on the face of every cop, every boss, everybody. And then he sets the stage up to make this systemic, structural, institutionalized racism real. Baldwin says, I don't know what most white people in this country feel, but I can only include what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church, which is white, and a Christian church, which is black. And I know, as Malcolm X once put it, the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. That says a great deal for me about a Christian nation. It means I can't afford to trust most white Christians and certainly cannot trust the Christian church. He goes on to say, I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter. But I know I'm not a part of their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby has anything against Black people, but I know the real estate lobby is keeping me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates Black people, but I know the textbooks they give my children to read and the schools they send me to and the areas where they're located. Now this, Professor Weiss, is the evidence. And you want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my life, my woman, my assistant, my children on some idealism, which you assure only exists in America, which I have never seen. And what Baldwin does here in this teaching moment is that he echoes, or I should say Braverman, because Braverman and others come after Baldwin. But what gets echoed here are Braverman and Baldwin's sentiments about the ingrainedness of structural, systemic, and institutional racism in America. Because systemic and structural racism, and because racial injustice permeates all sectors and areas, addressing them will require mutually reinforcing actions in multiple sectors and places. Acknowledging their existence is only one step. We must engage and press beyond persistent awareness. Self-awareness that leads to changing our ideas and attitudes and actions from racist to anti-racist. Sometimes focuses specifically on interpersonal racism. That is overt incidents between individuals. And this self-awareness that leads to interpersonal racist reflection often does not directly address the underlying systems or structures that are the bane of Black people's racist experiences in America. And focusing on interpersonal racism, though a good start, sometimes it does not get at explicitly targeting systems and structures. In chapters 7 through 11, we find that with the definitions and the discussions that Kendi offers, we come to more questions than answers. And that's a good thing about this work. So now as we turn our attention to even more questions, I'm going to invite you to do something. I'm going to invite you, as I did in the first video, to reflect upon a few questions, but this is what I like you to do pedagogically. If you're working in a church group and there's, maybe 5 or 4 groups or 6 groups, however you have it, I want each group to take a question and each group to reflect on that question. But let's say you're part of a reading group and it's just 5 or 6 of you to a reading group. I want each person in the reading group to take one question. But let's say you're working on your own and you're not a part of a group. I'm inviting you to select 2 questions that speak to you and do some reflection on those questions until we get to video 3. At the end of these series of questions that I will offer you in relation to video 1 and video 2 today, I'm going to offer 2 questions in the end that I want all of us to reflect on as we continue to move through how to be an anti-racist. You ready? Probing questions for individual or group reflection. And as I said, these are about 5 or 6 questions. I would like you to work in groups. If you're working by yourself, only select 2. There are a lot of questions here because I wanted to create a lot of questions to generate some fruitful discussion around this work. Who is Kendi's audience? And based on what you have read thus far, what do you understand Kendi to say or ask the church community to do? Now, there's a bit of this question in video 1, but I'm now getting closer to some theological terms with the words confession and redemption. Now, in reading this work, as Kendi, kind of unveils his memoir, his experiences, his stories, I want you to ask yourself, how does confession appear in this work? And then how does redemption appear in this work? If you see it, then here's the question. How are confession and redemption the scapegoats for reflecting on deep-rooted thoughts, actions, and expressions of racism? That is, how effective or sufficient is Kendi's strategy of telling his own story and admitting to be a racist to lead others toward a road of self-reflection, confession, and redemption? And then finally, are self-reflection, confession, and redemption effective starting points for confronting the complex, as Baldwin laid out and as Braveman laid out, complex and historical realities of more than 400 years of racism in America? And I want to add here that we're not talking about just the racism during slavery and people say, get over it. I'm talking about the racism that continued from slavery that still exists to this day. All right, and should white people be required to dig deep into their history and tell their stories, or is it sufficient for them to listen in as Black people express their experiences of racism? Does this approach remediate white racism? All right. What are your thoughts about Kendi's assertion that Black people can be cultural and behavioral racists and colorists through their actions and thoughts, or through their thoughts and actions? How can Black people resist the urge to cast all white people as racist, including those who have no connection to racist power structures? And how are we to respond to the power and privilege bequeathed to white people via the racist society in which we live, even if those people possess no formal authority to change the system? And finally, how does this self-reflective, self-help confessional deconstruct or address racist policies and power structures upon which America was founded and built? And so these are the group questions. And now I'm going to lead us right into the final two questions for each one of us to do some self-reflective work. You ready? What is your role in combating racism at home, work, school, church, and the various spheres you inhabit? Now here, I didn't say or, I said and. I want you to think about all the places you go. What is your role in combating racism? What are you puzzled about? Or what questions have been gnawing at you in response to this book? I always say that you know a book is good when it's raising critiques and questions. That means people are engaged in what is being said. So I want to know, what are you puzzled about? Like, what questions have been gnawing at you in response to this book? It's been a great journey. I am so happy to have been a part of this second video with you, and I can't wait until we get to the third. I do hope you have some good reflective time and energy, and that you also have time to rest as we join the movement towards racial justice. Have a good evening, everyone. Have a beautiful spring day.